The principles of graphic design are the rules that you apply to the elements. Basically, it's how to use the elements. The elements are focal point or emphasis, contrast, balance, movement, rhythm or pattern, and unity. Before tackling the principles, we need to talk about the format. Basically, what is it physically? Is this a print advertisement? Is this a book? Is it a billboard? Is it a web page? How we proceed is going to be dictated by what item we are creating. What is the physical size? Is it for print? Is it for web? This is going to determine how we proceed to create the item. That's the format. There are different standards for creating different pieces. A CD case is square. A DVD or Blu-ray case is rectangular. Posters come in standard sizes. A billboard has to meet certain qualifications like the size and the amount of type on the board. Somebody that's in a car driving by at 70 miles per hour cannot take the time to read a lot. But if you put a promotional piece in a newspaper or a magazine, you can have a lot more print. And pop-ups on a computer can have a link for more information. A game designed for a 6-year-old is going to have different standards and qualities than one designed for an adult. A printed piece has to consider the paper and consider the inks along with the specialty die cuts. Cost must be considered for the job as well. Once we know what we're going to create, we can proceed with how to design it. So again, we find there is no great consensus on the principles as we found on the elements. All the stuff is there, it's just what it's called and how it's presented. Well, a lot of principles tend to get grouped. This is one reason there's no standardized registration for graphic designers. We do, however, agree that we recognize good design when we see it and amateur design when we see it as well. So our book gives us emphasis, contrast, balance, movement, rhythm or pattern, and unity. Other books present just hierarchy, alignment, and unity. Hierarchy is basically emphasis. It's what's more important and what is emphasized. And yet another book has balance, contrast, direction, dominance, which is basically hierarchy, proportion, which is also kind of hierarchy, rhythm, and unity. So it's all over the board. So the first thing we're going to look at is hierarchy. Hierarchy tells you what to look at and in what order. How do you establish hierarchy? It isn't always just start at the top and go to the bottom and read from the left to the right. You establish hierarchy by creating a focal point or by putting emphasis on something. So how do we go about establishing this visual hierarchy? We can do this through several different methods. One is by putting the item in isolation. If we put the item by itself, everybody's going to wonder why it's by itself. It must be important, it must be different, we want to look at it. If we put the item at the top of the page very large or in the center of the page, we may see that that is more prominent because of where it's located. Maybe we make the scale of it very large. If it's very large and everything else is very small, we're going to want to look at it. Some other type of contrast could be maybe the shape is different, as in this example where we have all of these non-representational shapes and then we have a triangle. It's different. It makes it more attractive because we want to know why it's different. It's a curiosity. Or maybe we use directional pointers. Everything is directing us to one location. Oh, this one's directing us in a different place. The basics of hierarchy are: where do you want the viewer to look first? Where do you want the viewer to look second? And where do you want the viewer to look third? You use contrast, changing the size, the shape, the color, the texture. This helps the hierarchy to be established. You want people to look at something that's different, different type, different image. It draws attention. Okay, so we're talking about emphasis. Basically, pick your focal point. What is the most important thing on your layout, and how are you going to show that? This is sometimes called the principle of emphasis. Sometimes it's called the center of visual interest. Whatever you want to call it, it's the center of attention on your design. Contrast causes visual tension. We can use something called juxtapositioning. That's things that don't normally belong together get put together. Those bring objects together and create a message that's more complex. It could be putting two items together that aren't similar at all. It could be just as simple as changing the orientation. So if everything is sitting square, it's sitting on a diagonal. We use size, make it bigger, make it smaller. We can use shape, make it a different shape than everything else. We can use color, change the color. Contrast through texture, contrast through placement. Okay? If you don't have a focal point, the viewer doesn't know what they're supposed to look at first. And you can only have one focal point. If you have two, it's not a focal point. You can clump several items together to make a single focal point, but they better be tied together somehow. Your focal point can be anything as long as it's the most eye-catching item of visual information. Maybe it's the biggest. Maybe the shape is unique. Maybe the color is different. It has a different texture to it. It's put on a more prominent space on the page, maybe up at the top or right smack dab in the middle. Somehow it's different. Okay, so we do contrast through size. This is also called scale. You put large items juxtaposition next to small items to create contrast and interest. If everything else on your page is small, make something big. If everything on your page is big, make it small. Remember that anything that is larger is going to look like it's closer to you because of perspective. Things that are closer to you are bigger. Things that are off in the distance are small. Bigger, smaller, contrast. Bigger, smaller, contrast. Think about driving down the freeway. You're going to look at the signs that are closer to you first. If they go past you, you won't be able to see that information. If something is more important, make it bigger. Or you might want to make something very tiny so that people are more interested in why is there one little itty bitty thing that's smaller than everything else. You can use contrast through shape. If everything is square, make it round. If everything's round, make it square. If you have straight lines, how about putting in curved lines? We're conditioned to look at something that's different. We will turn our attention to the one thing that does not match everything else. If our background is black, make our one item white, or maybe make it red. We're drawn to that change in color because of everything else being the same. We are conditioned from that. It's built into us. If we have multiple items that are the same and we have one that's sitting by itself, we want to know why it's alone. It causes us to look at it because it's separate, and we will look more into that when we start talking about Gestalt theory. These are similar items, but we want to know all this coinage in the back. This one's brighter and it's positioned by itself. We've got some little oranges in the back and a squash in the front. They're the same color, but size and isolation make it different. The little parasols are all the same, but we have one that's positioned by itself. It's the same size, but it's why is it alone? We want to know. We are curious. Another way we can establish what to look at first is using directionals. All that means is we've got arrows or lines or something that direct everybody's attention to a particular object. Yes, we can literally draw arrows to point at what we want for our focal point. Or we can use something more structured like diagrams with trees and stairs or nesting on it. Pointy arrows, things that direct us. Look at me first. I'm important. Everything's pointing to me. Emphasis by having a dominant image on a page draws interest. Place a graphic element at the top left corner or the center of the page. Those are the areas on the page that viewers actually prefer. There's been studies on this. We gravitate towards the center of the page. We read from top to bottom, left to right, so put something at the top where it's going to be seen first. Or put it in the center, which is someplace our eye likes to go. We can have contrast through texture. That's a little more subtle. Okay, so like our shiny little ladybug sitting on a leaf, or a lemon, which is a smooth surface sitting on a fuzzy piece of cloth. It's not blatant, but you can get some nice subtleties out of this. How about the contrast between the flower petals and the asphalt? Now we're going to look at balance. We're going to look at alignment. Balance creates stability. Imagine a seesaw. When the seesaw is level, it's perfectly balanced. Each side of the board has the same weight on it. We create visual balance by using visual weight. We want our layouts to be balanced. So unless you want to leave people feeling unsettled, tense, or otherwise anxious, we want everything to be balanced. Balance is how you combine elements to create a feeling of equilibrium or stability to a work of art. In two-dimensional art, we're not referring to actual weight, but visual weight. Visual weight takes into account size, shape, value, color, and texture. They all work together within a graphic to determine that visual weight. A small dark object can carry the same visual weight as a large bright object, but it's also going to depend on placement. Different areas of a page can make an object appear to have more visual weight as well. Symmetrical balance is probably the easiest one to recognize. You simply split your format right down the middle and match the right side to the left side. You can split it on a horizontal and match top to bottom, but it's really more of a vertical axis that we look at. Symmetrical creates a mirror image. Symmetrical balance is also called formal balance. It's very traditional, it's very conservative. It's useful for many things, but it can be considered stuffy, it can be considered boring. It might work very well for something like a greeting card, but sometimes in the design world, we kind of think of it as being a little Mickey Mouse.